A blazing sun hangs over a dusty frontier street. Two men stand facing one another, hands low, eyes hard. If you've watched enough westerns, you already think you know how this ends. The twitch of a hand, the flash of steel, the fastest draw wins, and everyone else falls in slow motion. But the real Old West didn't work like that. Most gunfights weren't clean duels at high noon. They were messy, sudden, and full of tricks that had nothing to do with spinning a revolver or fanning the hammer like a circus act. The men and women who actually survived the frontier weren't stunt performers. They were problem solvers. They used subtle body language, clever holster setups, hidden guns, fake surrenders, and brutal close-quarters moves that almost never make it onto the movie screen. Today, we're pulling back the curtain. In this video, we're counting down 10 forgotten cowboy gun tricks Hollywood almost never shows. The practical, sometimes sneaky, sometimes downright dirty tactics that real frontier gunfighters used when things turned deadly. These aren't fantasy moves designed to look cool. They're the kind of tricks that gave you a crucial half-second, a clearer draw, or a final shot when everyone thought you were empty. Some of these tactics come from famous names like Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and Dallas Stoudenmire. Others are drawn from obscure accounts, old manuals, and frontier slang that's all but vanished. But every one of them reveals the same truth. On the real frontier, the smartest gunfighter usually outlived the flashiest. So settle your hat, keep your back to the wall, and watch your hands. Because by the end of this countdown, you'll never look at a Hollywood gunfight the same way again. Let's start with a draw that looks wrong on film, but was absolutely right in the saloon. The cross-draw twist, fast from the wrong side. Picture a cramped, smoky saloon. Cards slap on green felt. Laughter rises and falls. Under the table, boots rest on the brass rail. A cowboy sits sideways at the bar, his coat draped over a revolver that doesn't hang low on his right hip like the movies show. Instead, his pistol rides high on the opposite side, butt facing forward. To an untrained eye, it looks backwards. To someone who knows what they're seeing, it looks dangerous. This is the cross draw, a method with roots in Civil War cavalry and long hours in the saddle. Horse soldiers often carried their pistols on the opposite side of their dominant hand, butt forward, so they could reach across the body and draw smoothly while keeping the reins in the other hand. When the war ended and veterans drifted west, the habit traveled with them. On horseback, a low-slung, strong-side holster could jam against the saddle, coat, or cantle. In a saloon, it crashed into chair backs and table edges. A high, forward-angled cross-draw, though, allowed a seated man to reach his gun without standing, twisting, or broadcasting his intentions. One casual movement of the hand across the midsection. Coat pushed aside, fingers closing on the grip, and the gun was already turning, barrel clearing leather in a tight arc. Men like Wild Bill Hickok were known to wear their revolvers butt forward, resting their hands on the grips as they sat. Some period photographs show lawmen and scouts with holsters canted forward at sharp angles that make no sense if you imagine them drawing like movie cowboys. But if you picture that cross-draw twist, hand gliding across the belly, pistol turning as it rises, it suddenly makes perfect sense. Was it as dramatic as a low hip draw in slow motion? No. Was it effective when you were seated at a card table with trouble brewing across from you? Absolutely. The cross draw let a man defend himself without obvious preparation. From the front, it might look like he was simply adjusting his coat or reaching for chips. Only when the gun came up did his opponent realize that the wrong side holster had been the right choice all along. Hollywood rarely gets this right. Directors like the visual of a gun riding low and straight on the dominant hip. But in real frontier towns, especially among men who spent long hours on horseback or at tables, the cross-draw twist was a quiet advantage. Would you have expected the seated cowboy to outdraw the one already standing in the street? On the frontier, that happened more often than films will ever admit. And if real gunfighters were that careful about where they wore their pistols, they were even more careful about how many chambers they kept loaded. 5 beans in the wheel. Safety over 6 shots. In the movies, every cowboy slams 6 bullets into his cylinder, snaps it shut, and saunters out the door with a fully loaded gun and a devil-may-care grin. In reality, that kind of bravado could get you killed without a single shot fired. The classic Colt single-action Army and its contemporaries didn't have modern transfer bar safeties. When the hammer was down on a loaded chamber, the firing pin rested directly on the primer. A hard jolt, a dropped gun, a horse stumbling, a hammer knocked by accident could set that round off. Frontiersmen learned that lesson the hard way. Stories circulated of cowboys blown off their horses when a hoof hit the hammer spur, men sitting down too hard on a bench, pistols dropped on a picket line, going off when they kissed a rock. So the cautious, experienced shooters developed a simple rule. Load 5, leave 1 empty, rest the hammer on the empty chamber. 5 beans in the wheel, they called it. It was such a common practice that many seasoned lawmen and rangers insisted on it as standard. You carried a gun that technically held 6, but you treated it as a 5-shooter when you weren't actively in a fight. That way, if you were thrown from a bronco, jostled in a crowded street, or slammed into a post during an arrest, your own gun didn't betray you. Hollywood almost never shows this. Their cowboys never worry about accidental discharges. The revolver is either perfectly safe or perfectly dangerous, with nothing in between. But the men who actually lived with a pistol on their hip day and night knew better. They balanced risk and readiness, and they decided that 1 extra shot wasn't worth losing a foot, a femoral artery, or a life. Imagine riding across broken country for days, your revolver thumping against your leg. Would you feel easy knowing the hammer is resting on a live primer the whole time? Or would you accept 5 shots in exchange for peace of mind? On the real frontier, the answer was simple. You kept 5 beans in the wheel, unless you knew without a doubt that trouble was only moments away. But what if those 5 weren't enough? Smart fighters had a plan for that too. One Hollywood almost never bothers to show: the spare cylinder swap, an early speed reload. Gun smoke hangs in the air. A revolver clicks on an empty chamber. In a modern movie, the hero ducks behind cover and somehow reloads individual cartridges at lightning speed, or never seems to run dry at all. On the 19th century frontier, there was a different answer. Don't reload the chambers, replace the whole cylinder. Certain revolvers, especially the Remington 1858, lent themselves to this trick. Unlike the Colt percussion designs, which required you to half-cock the hammer, remove the wedge, and swing the barrel assembly forward, the Remington featured a solid top strap and a base pin that could be pulled straight out. Pop the pin, roll the cylinder out, slide a fresh one in, replace the pin, and you were back in business far faster than trying to ram powder, ball, and caps into an empty wheel under fire. During the Civil War, cavalry troopers quickly grasped the advantage. Many rode with preloaded spare cylinders in their saddlebags or pockets. The drill was simple: gallop in, empty the revolver, swap for a fresh cylinder, fire again, and only when everything was truly spent would a saber come out. The revolver wasn't a 6-shot, it was a repeating weapon, so long as you had cylinders ready. Veterans who went west after the war carried that habit with them. For a man armed with a Remington or another swappable cylinder design, a handful of loaded cylinders could be worth more than a pouch of loose cartridges. In a close-range fight, fumbling with powder flasks or cartridges was slow and risky. Swapping a cylinder, once practiced, became a smooth, almost musical motion. Push, pop, drop, slide, click, cock. Hollywood very rarely shows this because it requires a specific kind of revolver and a little mechanical understanding. And most audiences have been trained to associate Western handguns with solid frame cartridge Colts. But on parts of the frontier, and especially among men who had learned their trade during the 1860s, the spare cylinder reload was a very real edge. Imagine facing a man who seems to go empty after 6 shots, only to watch him rip out the cylinder and slap in another fully loaded wheel before you've even broken your grip on your own cartridges. That's the kind of surprise that ends a fight abruptly. Of course, not everyone had a Remington or carried spare cylinders. Many chose an even simpler solution to the "I'm out of ammo" problem. Don't reload, don't swap parts, just reach for a whole new gun. The hideout gun, the last chance pocket. Surprise, the air is hot and thick with whiskey and sweat. A card game explodes into an argument. Hands slam on the table, chairs topple, and suddenly revolvers boom in a deafening instant. When the smoke clears, one gambler is on his knees, his main revolver empty and lying on the floor. A bigger man looms over him, confident that the fight is finished. Then the unarmed gambler reaches into his boot or vest or sleeve. A tiny pistol appears. One last, desperate shot cracks through the din. End of story. Welcome to the world of the hideout gun. The Derringer, pocket pistol, or cut-down revolver that acted as a final insurance policy when everything else was spent or lost. Hollywood loves big iron on the hip, glinting in the sun. Real frontier towns, especially in more settled areas, saw plenty of concealed weapons instead. City ordinances often required guns to be worn discreetly. Gamblers didn't want heavy six-shooters dragging their coats out of line. Saloon keepers, prostitutes, barkeeps, and traveling salesmen needed protection that didn't announce itself. Enter the 2-shot Derringer, the tiny revolver, the single-shot boot pistol. A popular example was the Remington double-barreled Derringer in .41 rimfire, small enough to hide almost anywhere, but with enough punch at close range to seriously injure or kill. Women slipped them into muffs and handbags. Men tucked them into waistcoat pockets, along hatbands, or inside their boots. A Derringer didn't give you a firefight. It gave you 1 or 2 shots when the enemy thought you were helpless. Many documented killings on the frontier involved just such guns, delivered at shockingly close range, often during what seemed like the after of a fight. Gun empty, hands raised, hat in the dirt, and then a palm-sized pistol settles the score. In cinema, the hideout gun is an occasional gimmick. In reality, it was a constant presence. Not everyone wanted or was allowed to walk around with a full-size revolver for all to see, but almost everyone who could afford it wanted some kind of last-ditch option. If your main gun misfired, was knocked away, or ran dry, the hideout gun had one job: give you one more chance. Would you have trusted your life to a tiny 2-shot at arm's length? Plenty of real frontier people did, and more than a few lived because of it. And when all the guns were empty, some lawmen and cowboys didn't draw another firearm at all. They turned the one they already had into something cruder and just as frightening: buffaloing, turning the gun into a club. A rowdy drunk refuses to leave the saloon. He shoves a deputy, curses the marshal, and reaches for a bottle as a weapon. The lawman has a loaded revolver in his hand and every legal excuse to pull the trigger. Instead, he steps in and swings. The heavy barrel of his Colt cracks across the drunk's skull with a sickening thud. The man drops like a sack of grain. Blood, silence. No gunshot, no corpse, just one very sore head and a clear message. On the frontier, this was called buffaloing, using a revolver as an impact weapon, usually to subdue rather than to kill. The term buffalo had several meanings in 19th century slang, including to intimidate or baffle someone. Over time, in Western usage, it came to mean pistol whipping, clouding a suspect, outlaw, or belligerent with the solid metal of a revolver instead of wasting ammunition or taking a life. Lawmen like Wyatt Earp were known for this. In noisy, crowded boom towns with fragile reputations and even more fragile tempers, shooting every drunk or cheat wasn't an option. Killing a man could spark a feud, a newspaper scandal, or a revenge attack. Knocking him unconscious was often more practical. A Colt peacemaker weighed well over 2 pounds. firearms. Swung with intent, it delivered enough force to crack skulls, break teeth, and drop even a strong man in an instant. Some officers actually preferred to hold the gun by the barrel and smash with the grip frame. Others used the barrel as the striking surface. Either way, buffaloing had its own brutal etiquette. Aim for the scalp, not the temple, if you didn't want a homicide on your hands. This harsh tactic rarely appears in Western films, where heroes either shoot or throw a clean Hollywood punch. But period newspaper accounts and memoirs mention men being buffaloed by marshals and deputies, hauled off to jail with blood-matted hair and pounding headaches. It was ugly, risky, and sometimes fatal, but it was absolutely real. Would you rather be shot or knocked out with 3 pounds of steel? On the frontier, that question wasn't always rhetorical. Buffaloing reveals another truth about real gunfighters. They weren't obsessed with looking stylish. They were obsessed with ending the problem fast. And when it came to carrying more than one gun, they weren't trying to look like a movie poster either. The 1-2 punch. 2 guns used the smart way. The classic movie image is irresistible. A gunslinger striding down the street with a revolver in each hand, firing both at once, mowing down enemies in a spray of bullets and smoke. It looks incredible. It's also almost entirely fantasy. Real frontier gunmen certainly carried 2 guns. In fact, many experienced lawmen, scouts, and troublemakers wore a matched pair of revolvers. But they didn't do it to shoot like an action hero. They did it for something much simpler: redundancy. Wyatt Earp later said that most serious 6-gun toters carried 2 pistols, but that the second was primarily a backup. Guns could jam, cylinders could bind, springs could break. A misfire at the wrong moment could get you killed. So if the first gun failed or ran dry, you didn't reload under fire. You dropped it or holstered it and drew the second. This is sometimes called a New York reload in modern law enforcement slang. Rather than fumbling with cartridges, you just switch to another weapon. Consider Marshall Dallas Staudenmeier in the famous 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight. He didn't stand there fanning 2 pistols like a cartoon. He used his guns one at a time, making his shots count. When one was empty or no longer convenient, the other came into play. The same goes for many documented shootists. 1 gun in the hand, the other waiting its turn. Could some gifted shooters alternate hands, firing a shot from one, then the other? Probably. But accurately aiming 2 guns at once, especially in a chaotic real fight, was a good way to miss with both. The real trick wasn't shooting 2 pistols simultaneously. It was transitioning smoothly between them. Gun empty? Don't waste time. Let it go, let it drop, or shove it in the holster, and draw the second in one practiced motion. Hollywood rarely shows this calm, methodical approach because it looks less exciting than a spinning, dual-wielding barrage. But from a survival standpoint, it was smarter, safer, and far more likely to end in your favor. Would you stake your life on spraying bullets from both hands, or on one fast, controlled gun at a time with a backup ready when the first ran dry? The men who left their names in history books chose the second option, and their biggest trick wasn't speed so much as self-control. The calm aim, beating, fan-firing, and hip-shooting. You know the Hollywood move. A cowboy yanks his revolver from the holster, keeps it low at the hip, and slaps the hammer repeatedly with his offhand, unleashing a thunderstorm of bullets in half a second. Dust flies, enemies tumble, and the hero looks like a gun-slinging god. On the actual frontier, that kind of shooting was usually a recipe for missing everything that mattered. Many of the most respected real gunmen had nothing but contempt for fan-firing and wild hip-shooting. Men like Wyatt Earp, who actually survived multiple gunfights, later said the same thing in different ways. The man who takes a fraction of a second to aim usually beats the man who sacrifices everything for speed. Here's the logic. Fanning the hammer is fast, but it destroys your grip and your sight picture. Every slap of the hand jars the gun. Every muzzle flip pushes your shots higher and wider. At 5 feet in a circus show, that might still hit a plank. At 15 feet in a real fight with your life on the line, it turns your bullets into random noise. By contrast, the deliberate shooter draws quickly, but then stops rushing. He brings the gun to where he can at least roughly align it, chest high or eye level. He cocks the hammer with his thumb as the gun rises. He fires each shot as a separate, controlled event. This doesn't mean he moves slowly. It means he spends his speed on the parts that matter, getting the gun clear, pointed, and under control, rather than on a flurry of wasted trigger pulls. Old-timers put it this way: take your time, in a hurry. Some accounts even describe certain famous shooters practicing with empty guns over and over until their draw and first shot were a single, fluid motion. They didn't obsess over emptying the cylinder. They obsessed over making the first round count because that was usually the one that decided whether they went home or lay in the street. Exhibition shooters in the later Wild West shows could fan 6 shots in a blink. They were entertainers, not lawmen in real gunfights. When bullets were actually flying both ways, the calm, aimed shooter had the advantage. So while Hollywood loves the visual of a blazing, hip-shooting storm, the frontier's deadliest men often won with something much less glamorous. One smooth draw, one steady breath, one well-placed shot. And yet some of those calm marksmen still train for something extremely daring. A move so subtle and complex that you've almost never seen it on screen. The border shift. Swapping guns mid-fight. Imagine a cramped stable at dusk. A deputy crashes in with a revolver in each hand. In the first heartbeat, he fires 5 shots from his right-hand Colt, dropping and scattering attackers. Then, just as one outlaw barrels toward him from the side, his primary gun clicks empty. Most men would panic, backpedal, or start fumbling for cartridges. This one does something else. He flips the empty revolver into his left hand while simultaneously swinging the still loaded gun from his left into his right. In one dizzying movement, the ready pistol ends up in his best shooting hand. Before the charging outlaw quite understands what he's seen, the deputy fires again, this time from his strong side, and the fight is over. That split-second swap is often called the border shift, a term born along the turbulent U.S.-Mexico frontier where gunmen were notoriously creative with their weapons. It's a kind of sleight of hand, a juggling trick with lethal stakes. The idea is simple. You carry 2 guns. You shoot with your dominant hand. When that gun runs dry at a critical moment, you don't waste time reloading or awkwardly shooting with your weaker hand. You trade guns in mid-motion, so your good hand always holds the working pistol. Some accounts suggest that the move could be so fast that onlookers barely understood what had happened. 1 second, the shooter is holding guns in both hands. The next, he's firing again with the same hand that just went empty. Pulling off the border shift required 3 things. Ambidexterity enough not to drop anything. Practice until the movement was instinctive. Nerves steady enough to try it under real fire. Most men never attempted it outside of practice. As Wyatt Earp supposedly pointed out, if you were skilled enough to pull off that kind of trick, you were probably skilled enough not to need it very often. Still, in the rare cases where it was used successfully, it gave the shooter an almost unfair edge. Continuous fire with maximum control, as though the gun never truly went dry. Hollywood virtually ignores the border shift for a simple reason. It's subtle. There's no big theatrical spin, no slow-motion leap. It's a tiny, technical movement, swapping grips and positions faster than the camera can dramatize. But subtle doesn't mean unimportant. In a real gunfight, the difference between click and bang, measured in fractions of a second, could mean everything. And a man who could make his backup gun appear in his strong hand, as if by magic, was a man you did not want to corner. And speaking of magic, not all frontier tricks were purely in the hands. Some were built into the hardware itself, like a bizarre piece of gear that allowed a gun to be fired almost without drawing it at all. The Bridgeport rig, quick-draw hardware, Hollywood forgot. You see a lawman walking down a boardwalk in a rough mining camp. Your eye catches something odd at his waist. His revolver isn't sitting in a leather holster. Instead, it hangs from a metal clip attached directly to his belt, exposed but forward and ready. It looks almost unfinished, like he forgot half his rig. You'd be wrong. This strange device was called the Bridgeport rig, patented in the early 1880s. It was one of the Old West's first true quick-draw gadgets. The concept was ingenious. A metal bracket on the belt engaged a specially modified screw or stud on the Colt's frame. The revolver essentially hung on this mount, held firmly in place but not wrapped in leather. Because the gun was already out in the open, there was no holster throat to clear, no friction to fight, and no retention strap to pop. With practice, a man could do something that seems almost like cheating. He could twist the revolver up and fire it while it was still attached to his belt. Imagine facing someone armed like that. You think he'll have to draw like everyone else. Instead, in one snapping motion, his hand slaps the grip, twists the gun upward, and the first shot goes off from the hip before your own pistol has even cleared leather. Some lawmen swore by the Bridgeport. It allowed extremely fast access, made it harder for an opponent to rip the gun free in a struggle, and kept the revolver fixed in a consistent position. In gritty towns where an extra fraction of a second might decide everything, that was no small advantage. But the rig had downsides. The exposed gun was vulnerable to rain, dust, and impacts. The specialized screw could break. Not every department or individual wanted to modify their revolver around a single piece of kit. Over time, the Bridgeport remained a niche solution, overshadowed by more conventional holsters. Hollywood almost never shows it because it doesn't match the iconic leather and concho look of the cinematic cowboy belt. But the Bridgeport rig is a perfect example of how creative the real frontier could be when it came to shaving time off the draw. It was the 1880s answer to a modern question. How do I get my gun into the fight faster than the other guy? And that brings us to perhaps the most audacious trick of them all. One that didn't just cheat time, but cheated the entire idea of surrender. The road agent's spin. From I give up to I've got you. A dusty road, a lone outlaw. A half circle of shotguns and rifles aimed squarely at his chest. Drop your gun, the leader orders. Nice and easy. The outlaw looks around, weighs his odds, and knows the math. Slowly he nods and turns his revolver around, holding it by the barrel with the butt extended toward the nearest man. On the surface, it's the picture of surrender, but his finger is hooked, so gently you'd never notice, inside the trigger guard. As the captor reaches for the grip, believing he's taking possession of a dead weapon, the outlaw moves. The revolver whips in a tight arc, pivoting around that hooked finger. In a blink, the butt that was pointing outward now points back, and the barrel has swung up into firing position. Before the startled captor can react, the outlaw squeezes the trigger he already holds. Boom! One moment, he looked beaten. The next, he owns the fight. This high-risk, high-reward maneuver is known in frontier lore as the road agent spin. Road agents were highwaymen, robbers who stopped coaches and travelers. They knew that sometimes the only way out of a bad situation was to weaponize the other man's overconfidence. The road agent spin wasn't common. No sane man practiced it casually. But it was famous enough to earn a place in Old West vocabulary. It required a gambler's nerve, a stage magician's timing, and the reflexes of a knife fighter. Botch it, and you might drop the gun or blow your own hand apart. Get it right, and you turn your enemy's mercy into your own lethal advantage. Savvy lawmen learned from this. Many refused to ever take a gun directly from a prisoner's hand. Instead, they ordered suspects to toss weapons away, set them down and step back, or remove an entire gun belt and kick it aside. They'd heard the stories of men who tried to hand over a gun and ended up handing out a surprise instead. Hollywood almost never touches this trick, partly because it looks unrealistic if you don't understand the mechanics, and partly because it's morally murky. It makes the outlaw look more like a knife thrower than a romantic rogue. But it did exist, hovering in the gray zone between desperation and genius. Would you have trusted an enemy who politely extended his revolver butt first? On the real frontier, many men learn not to, because in a place where gunfights had no referees, even surrender could be a lie. Conclusion: the grit beneath the glamour. 10 tricks. 10 glimpses into how guns were really used on the frontier. The cross-draw twist, letting seated cowboys and ex-cavalrymen strike faster than anyone expected. The quiet caution of 5 beans in the wheel, sacrificing 1 shot for a safer carry. The clever spare cylinder swap, turning certain revolvers into early repeat fire machines. The humble but deadly hideout gun, hiding salvation in a boot, bra, or vest pocket. The brutal practicality of buffaloing, where a revolver became a club to end fights without a hail of bullets. The realistic use of 2 guns, not for showy dual wielding, but for smart, staggered fire and backup. The supremacy of calm aim over wild fanning, where 1 controlled shot beat 6 frantic ones. The daring border shift, juggling guns mid-fight, so the strong hand always held the live steel. The ingenious Bridgeport rig, a mechanical answer to the eternal question of who can draw first, and the nerve-shredding road agent spin, turning apparent surrender into a last-second reversal. All of them point to a single, uncomfortable truth. The real Old West wasn't a choreographed ballet of fair fights and flashy tricks. It was a ruthless, improvisational grind where people did whatever worked as long as it kept them alive. Hollywood gave us iconic images, low-slung holsters, fan-fired 6 guns, and endless ammunition. The frontier gave its survivors scars, experience, and a catalog of small, clever edges that rarely look glamorous, but often made all the difference. Now that you've seen behind the curtain, which of these gun tricks surprised you the most? Was it the idea of carrying only 5 rounds on purpose? The fact that derringers and spare cylinders were more common than you'd think? Or the chilling thought that even a man handing over his gun might be seconds away from turning it on you? Let me know in the comments which tactic you'd trust if you were walking into a saloon where you weren't sure everyone liked you. Would you choose the cross draw, the hideout gun, the second revolver, or just a calmer aim than the fellow across from you? If you want more real Wild West history, the weapons, the tactics, and the human tricks that separate legend from truth, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next deep dive. In the end, the deadliest gunfighters of the Old West didn't win because they were the fastest or the flashiest. They won because they were the ones who prepared, who adapted, and who knew one simple rule. In a real gunfight, the smartest trick of all is doing whatever it takes to walk away.